there are so many memories working with Jim. But Jim was a great socialiser. He used to love going out. And I remember this particular week, he booked a whole week of charity events for us to attend. And by the end of the week, we were all like zombies, but like Jim was bright as a button. But the thing is, Jim always used to come into the office like 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. And so like you wouldn't dare not turn in or turn up late. And but I think he did have a little secret, because like he'd often close all the blinds in his office and say to me, "Don't disturb me for an hour, my girl." So I think he might have had a little power nap to keep him going.
So my favourite memory of Jim is when we were out at dinner. After dinner, we'd have drinks, etc. And I'd usually order a Jack Daniels and Coke. And you know, like the way it would come out with a glass with Jack Daniels in, some ice, and a bottle of Coke. So every time without fail, I'd be standing there with the Coke, literally about to pour it in, and Jim would be like, "Chris, you're not going to ruin that perfectly good whiskey with that Coke, are you?" And I'd be like, no, Jim, I was, just saving that for after kind of thing, and then just drink it straight, etc. But it was like a running joke, that would be what would happen.
Probably the first encounter I ever had with Jim was actually at my interview. Normally everybody's been for jobs, you have an interview in a room with a person, but I was actually sat at one end of his table, his desk in his office. He was at the other end, working. I was sat opposite then the managing director, having my interview. Now, if that's not a lot of pressure to get things right at the interview, I don't know what is. But that was my first time I'd ever seen him. To me, he was just another person. The first time I had any real encounter with him was probably about 8-10 years later. I've been just working in electronics as I was employed to do. But in those days, the early 80s, you had to help out. It was not expected of you, but everybody did different jobs. So I was asked to go and help in covering. Well, I didn't know at that time, Jim also worked in covering in the mornings. So I'm studying covering. And in those days, you didn't get any training as such. There's the box, there's the covering, get on with it. And so I'm quite happily doing as best as I can, and there's this, I can say, old guy stood next to me, tutting the whole time. Didn't say anything to me. He then went off. I was in there all day doing this. Didn't think anything of it, but I found out later that he'd actually gone back in, said to the managing director, "Who the heck was that? He's no good at covering," and he told him who I was. So about 3 weeks later, I was helping out again, and he came down, and came over and spent half an hour, 3/4 of an hour showing me exactly how to do the covering. And it was after that, it was not just a point of, he's the boss. It was he came in and always had a chat. And it was from there on that I suppose the friendship, if you can call it a friendship, started. It went on like that, and then about 2 years later, I was then in charge of service, or in those days it was just test. We used to service amps within electronics. And I got a phone call from his then secretary saying, "Are you free for lunch?" And I'm thinking, well, yeah, all right then. So I went, come out at 12 o'clock into the foyer. I say this was about 12 o'clock. I wandered out there not knowing what to expect. And there was Jim, and there was a couple of his friends there. And I found out later what had happened is that Jim wasn't technical, not electronically technical, and he never claimed to be. What had happened, somebody had been talking, one of his friends had been talking to him about how the amps work or whatever. And so he asked who's the best person to come, so I got volunteered. And we went out to lunch, and in those days, I wasn't sure what to expect, and we left at 12 o'clock and got back at 3:30. A lot of the worse for wear. When we got there, and in those days, I'd never drunk red wine. I didn't drink it, it was upset me. So the red wine started to flow, and I said to Jim, "I'm sorry, I don't drink red wine." So we bought a bottle of white. He said, "Well, nobody else drinks white, so that's yours." So it was then a point of having to drink a whole bottle of wine to myself. in the middle of the day. I wanted to come back and go to sleep, but I don't think I was allowed. But that was, and then that went on probably once a month for the next 10, 15 years. It was a peculiar arrangement when you think about it, but it was always friendly. Probably the best one, or the best comment I've ever heard Jim made on one of these particular meals we went out. And I say a couple of friends from the Water Rats was there, and we were talking. And from a bit of background, from '96, Jim started giving us a bottle of whiskey every year for Christmas, all dated. And we were talking, as we know that Jim liked to drop whiskey occasionally. He opened his bottle up, and he said to everybody, the story about it. Somebody commented because he got one with a date on it, and he commented and he says, "Oh yeah, Phil's got a full set. He's only waiting for me to die so he can get it more money for it." And it was him saying it with a chuckle behind him, but it was that sort of humour he had.
Many memories of Jim. Was lucky enough to know him on a personal level as well as work. But one of the things that I used to really love about him was the fact that when I first started many years ago, he used to take us out at Christmas, and we'd all go out for a Christmas party. And he'd come along, we'd all go out for a meal. But one year we had a fancy dress party, which was particularly good fun. We went to one of the pubs in Woburn, had a private room there. But what, for me, the best thing was that nobody really knew what anybody was going to turn up as, so we'd all gone to a lot of effort. And for me, the best thing about Jim was that he turned up dressed as the Pope. And absolutely brilliant costume, gone to a lot of effort. But what was even better was at the time his PA was Julie Sarasola, and she was pregnant at the time, and she went as a nun. And so the two of them together was just absolutely perfect. And to me, that was a great thing about Jim, was his sense of humour, which he had a great one, very dry, absolutely fantastic. But yeah, for me, that's a real fond memory of Jim and just what he was like.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. My father was a workaholic, which is inspirational to everyone else within the company and to me. When we started the retail side back in 1960, my father was a full-time drum teacher and I was a professional musician. So we didn't take a penny out of the company. Everything profit from what we were selling came back into the company. The growth pattern was unbelievable. Within a couple of years, we were working on the concept to actually make the first amplifier. This was caused because of someone called Pete Townsend of The Who, and my father was a very practical man because he started off his life as a toolroom miller in Aircraft Corporation down in Southall. So he had a lot of practical awareness to actually make cutting tools for speaker cabinets, everything to do, because everything was hand built when we first started. It was the jigsaw, it was everything was, count your fingers at the end of the day with the equipment we were using to make first of all. But because my dad was so inspirational, I would say, because of his attitude. And once we started making the first few amplifiers, etc., the first one was seen by the likes of Pete Townsend, because he was inspirational for us to start, because he pestered for something more than was available. So my dad designed the first 4x12, and obviously people can appreciate every 4x12 you see that's got a different label on it, it was because of my dad. All right, and it's the most imitated product in the world. But it's the best compliment you can have because we were first. And so my dad was instrumental to that design. When we started making cabinets completely and doing our own Rexine covering, etc., my father stopped teaching and he was on the factory floor. He was actually doing Rexine covering, which is the application of a contact adhesive which we used, which was rubberised in those days, not like the modern glues we use. And my mum actually worked alongside him, and she actually put the glue on the materials and the cabinets, and he did all the covering. I used to join them in the morning to do work alongside my dad on that side, and then back into the retail in the second half of the day. So it was hectic times, but we just gave it all. And I say the growth of the company, when we first formed the manufacturing company, which was in May '64, there was the same three directors we had at the beginning, which was my father, myself, and my mum. My mum was, her name was Violet, and it's the same three directors when we formed the actual manufacturing company in '64. And the growth was unbelievable. I say purely through hard work, which I say my father was the inspiration for that. And the growth, I can compare it to a .com company without the internet.
Yeah, I mean, what drove Jim was his passion for music. And that's kind of what defined him, made him the man that he was. Every day that he always came into the office first, and he always wanted to know what was going on. And he was, every day was interesting. Bit of a roller coaster ride, bit of a challenge. I thoroughly enjoyed working with him. And we had a great time together. Do I miss Jim? Of course I do. He was an inspiration, he was an icon, he was a man in the industry, he was just Jim Marshall. So I'd just like to say, thanks Jim, the father of Loud. You're missed, but never forgotten.